So, the United States just requested Canada for a $573 billion railway rescue. Not proposed one, requested one. The most dominant economy in the recorded world. The country that has spent 2 years enforcing tariffs, commerce barriers, sovereignty infringements, and persistent economic pressure on its nearest partner. Just ask that partner to kindly reinstate the cargo rail operations that American commerce relies on to operate. Because the North American Railway Network, it appears, is Canadian. The locomotives are Canadian. The rails are Canadian. The supply chain systems that coordinated the transport of American wheat, American vehicle components, American crude petroleum, American industrial chemicals, American timber, and American retail products are based in Montreal and Calgary. 2 of the 7 Class I railways in North America, Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, are Canadian-held, Canadian-managed corporations that maintain extensive systems inside the United States on American territory, hauling American cargo linking American municipalities. And when Canada shifted its commerce away from the United States toward international markets, the railways tracked the commerce. The locomotives that previously traveled south to Chicago and Detroit and Memphis are traveling east to Halifax and Montreal and west to Vancouver and Prince Rupert because that's where the appetite is now. And American plants can't obtain components. American growers can't transport wheat. American processing facilities can't obtain crude. American shops can't fill inventory. And the projected expense of the interruption, the accumulated cargo, the stalled manufacturing, the spoiling wheat, the spreading dysfunction rippling through every division of the American economy is $573 billion over 3 years. And Canada declined, not merely declined. Canada revealed a $30 billion east-west rail pathway expansion, a substantial infrastructure commitment that permanently diverts Canadian cargo capacity toward international shipping terminals and away from the American boundary. The rescue was rejected. The infrastructure that would have supported American commerce is being constructed in an alternate direction. And every dollar of concrete placed on the east-west pathway is a dollar of capacity that will never go back to north-south operations. Warren Buffett, who holds BNSF Railway, one of the biggest cargo carriers in North America, and who has devoted 60 years examining the economics of transporting products by rail, stated, "This is the most foreseeable infrastructure emergency in American history." And then he articulated with the credibility of someone who doesn't merely examine railways, but holds one, why you cannot conduct economic conflict on the nation that holds your rail system and anticipate the locomotives to operate on schedule, and why requesting a rescue from the country you've been pressuring isn't a bargaining approach. It's an admission. But the statement that is being described as the most embarrassing phrase ever aimed at an American president by a partnered leader, the statement Carney expressed when questioned whether Canada would evaluate Trump's railway stabilization suggestion, is 9 words that communicated to the United States something no partner has ever possessed the position or the justification to declare you don't get to damage it and then request us to repair it. When you comprehend how the North American Railway Network truly functions and who controls it, how the commerce conflict cascaded into a rail supply chain breakdown that nobody in Washington projected, what $573 billion of harm resembles on the ground throughout every significant American sector, why Trump requested a rescue, and what the appeal exposes, what Canada's constructing instead of reinstating operations. What Buffett expressed about the most fundamental principle of transportation economics and why American growers and manufacturing laborers in competitive districts are the ones bearing the burden. You'll comprehend why this isn't a supply chain interruption. It's the instant the most dominant economy on Earth realized it can't transport its own products. Press subscribe because this railway emergency is about to impact American food costs, American manufacturing production, and American agricultural revenue simultaneously, and every solution passes through Ottawa. To comprehend how the most dominant economy on Earth wound up requesting its neighbor for a railway rescue, you have to comprehend something that nearly nobody, including evidently the individuals who architected the commerce conflict, understood about how products truly travel in North America. The North American Cargo Railway Network is not three independent national systems that coincidentally link at boundary crossings. It is a unified, consolidated continental network engineered over a century and a half to transport products across the landmass with peak efficiency and minimal resistance. The U.S.-Canada boundary is not a separating barrier in the network. It is a junction invisible in standard operation. Continuous in function and so completely embedded into the supply chain structure of both countries that most individuals overlooked it was present, including the individuals who chose to rupture it. The discovery that astonishes most Americans when they learn it, and that apparently astonished the President of the United States when it was communicated to him in a session, is who controls the network. Canadian National Railway, based in Montreal, manages a rail system that reaches from the Canadian Atlantic shoreline to the Gulf of Mexico. Its American activities cover Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Tennessee. CN doesn't merely transport Canadian products across the boundary. It transports American products within the United States. Wheat from the Midwest to Gulf terminals, industrial chemicals from Louisiana to manufacturing plants in the Northeast, vehicle parts between facilities across the manufacturing heartland. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, based in Calgary, was established by the combination of Canadian Pacific Railway and Kansas City Southern, forming the sole single-route rail system linking Canada, the United States, and Mexico. CPKC functions across the American Midwest, the Southern Plains, the Gulf Coast, and into Mexico, transporting everything from potash to petroleum to intermodal containers. These are not minor activities supplementing an American-controlled network. CN and CPKC are two of the 7 Class I railways in North America, the classification designated for the continent's biggest cargo operators, together with their Canadian national activities. They manage a considerable portion of all cargo transportation. They hold the rails. They hold the engines. They hold the freight cars. They hire the workers. They determine the timetables. They distribute the capacity, and they reach those conclusions in Canadian executive offices under Canadian corporate leadership, representing Canadian business priorities. What these railways transport for the American economy resembles a components catalog for the nation itself. Wheat from Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and the Dakotas to shipping terminals and domestic processors. Crude petroleum from Canadian reserves to American processing facilities across the Midwest and Gulf. Vehicle components between cross-boundary manufacturing facilities. The identical consolidated auto distribution network that was already splintering chemicals, fertilizers, timber, steel, potash, produced goods, retail products, and intermodal containers transporting everything from technology to apparel from Pacific terminals to interior distribution hubs. Contemporary cargo supply chains operate on accuracy rail cars, scheduled to show up within hours of when they're required. Stock systems adjusted to rail shipping schedules. Manufacturing timetables constructed around the expectation that the cargo will circulate. There is no tactical stockpile of vehicle components stored in a facility. There is no reserve grain storage waiting to handle a crop that can't travel. The network functions because it is dependable. It was dependable because the cross-boundary partnership was operational. When the partnership fractured, the dependability fractured with it. And nobody in Washington had projected what would occur afterward. And here is what occurred. When the commerce conflict intersected with the truth of who controls the railways, because the interruption didn't emerge in a single spectacular event, it emerged the identical way every emergency in this standoff has emerged, through spreading, intensifying secondary consequences that the designers of the commerce conflict never evaluated because they never examined past the primary effects of their individual strategies. As Canada methodically diverted its shipments away from the United States and toward international markets, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Asia, the Indo-Pacific, the appetite for north-south cross-boundary rail capacity diminished. Fewer Canadian products traveling south means fewer locomotives traveling south. Concurrently, appetite for east-west rail capacity increased. Canadian manufacturers needed to transport products to harbor cities for maritime shipment to the emerging markets that were substituting American purchasers. Halifax on the Atlantic, Montreal, Vancouver, and Prince Rupert on the Pacific. The harbors were expanding. The rail movement to the harbors was expanding, and CN and CPKC, as logical enterprises responding to commercial indicators, redistributed capacity correspondingly. More locomotives traveling east and west, fewer locomotives traveling south. The redistribution wasn't directed by the Canadian administration. It wasn't a governmental decision. It was a business one. Capacity tracks appetite. Appetite tracks commerce. And commerce had been purposefully methodically diverted by the identical tariffs and barriers that the United States had enforced. The amplifying consequence was severe. Canada's numerous commerce countermeasures, energy limitations, mineral shipment restrictions, agricultural diversion, vehicle components guidelines all diminished the quantity of products crossing the boundary by rail. Reduced cross-boundary commerce meant reduced cross-boundary rail appetite. Reduced appetite meant reduced distributed capacity. Reduced capacity meant extended delays, reduced dependable coordination in a cargo network that was growing steadily ineffective for American dispatchers, not because anyone proclaimed a rail blockade, but because the financial motivations that had made north-south operations efficient and dependable had been systematically eliminated by the commerce conflict itself. Canadian railways additionally began favoring Canadian national and shipping dispatches over American cross-boundary cargo, a logical business conclusion aligned with where earnings and quantity were expanding. American dispatchers weren't obstructed, they were deprioritized. Their cargo traveled later, slower with reduced certainty, and in a supply chain network constructed on exact scheduling, later and slower means the complete subsequent system. Manufacturing plants, distribution facilities, shops, buyers' fractures, and the results struck the American economy like a gradual cascade. Undetectable initially, then present simultaneously, American grain storage facilities across the Midwest reached maximum and remained maxed. Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, the Dakotas, growers collecting harvests with nowhere to warehouse them because the storage couldn't discharge, because the locomotives that would typically transport the wheat to shipping terminals and manufacturing operations weren't arriving at the regularity or dependability they previously did. Wheat remaining in storage for weeks instead of days deteriorates. Heat variations, moisture, insect vulnerability. Wheat that remains too long drops classification, drops certification, drops the elevated pricing. That creates the distinction between a lucrative crop and a devastating one. Millions of tons of American wheat at danger of deterioration. Not because of drought, not because of infection, not because of a weather catastrophe, but because the locomotives that transport it are traveling east and west now instead of south. Animal operations reliant on rail-shipped feed reported deficiencies. Feed operations in Kansas and Texas spending elevated rates for trucked wheat because rail shipping had grown unpredictable. Agricultural shipment windows. The narrow schedules during which American wheat competes on worldwide commodity exchanges against Brazilian, Argentine, Australian, and Canadian. Wheat missed because the cargo couldn't travel rapidly enough. The vehicle industry confronted a combined emergency. The Canadian components limitations were already choking production lines. Now the supply chain network that ships the components that do satisfy commerce requirements was itself declining. Components that satisfied the shipment guidelines waited in rail stations seeking capacity. Parts that were expected to show up in hours showed up in weeks. Production lines that were already functioning at diminished output due to component deficiencies now confronted the supplementary problem of supply chain breakdowns on the components that were obtainable. The two emergencies didn't combine, they compounded. Energy deliveries by rail, crude petroleum, natural gas fluids. Propane warming fuel decreased across the Midwest and northern regions. Processing facilities operating below output because rail-shipped crude showed up behind schedule. Propane distribution to countryside communities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan interrupted ahead of cold season. Communities that rely on rail-shipped propane for warming confronting the possibility of deficit during the harshest months. Industrial plants reporting raw material postponements of 2 to 4 weeks. Retail distribution facilities across the northern United States reporting stock shortfalls as intermodal container transport decelerated. Buyer costs increasing as supply chain expenses surged. Road transport, the sole substitute to rail, expenses 3 to 5 times greater per ton distance, and the road transport sector doesn't possess the ability to manage the excess. The American Logistics Association described it as the most critical cargo interruption since World War II. The estimated financial toll measured from postponed deliveries, reduced manufacturing, agricultural deterioration, accelerated road transport expenses, production stalled time, distribution network reorganization, and spreading dysfunction was $573 billion over 3 years. The figure distributed across every division. Agricultural damages surpassing $85 billion. Manufacturing interruptions exceeding $140 billion. Energy distribution network expenses above $55 billion. Direct cargo postponement expenses above $120 billion. Spreading buyer cost increases and market competitiveness, damages comprising the remainder. Every dollar linked through a sequence of origin and outcome to a commerce conflict that interrupted the commerce, which interrupted the rail, which interrupted everything the rail transports, which is everything. And then Trump did something no American president has ever done in the record of the bilateral partnership. He requested Canada for assistance. The administration suggested a collaborative North American railway stabilization structure, a bilateral accord that would reinstate complete cross-boundary cargo rail operations, ensure American dispatchers preferential access to Canadian rail systems, and divide the infrastructure funding expenses between the two administrations. The suggestion was presented as cooperative continental supply chain management and combined infrastructure funding, diplomatic phrasing crafted to conceal the essential dynamic. The United States requesting Canada to reinstate an operation that Canada has no duty to deliver during a commerce conflict. The United States initiated because American commerce cannot operate without it. The embarrassment was foundational and unavoidable. Remove the diplomatic phrasing and the image as a superpower that has devoted 2 years enforcing tariffs, requiring compliance, endangering partnerships, leveraging resources, limiting commerce, and pressuring its neighbor into compliance. Now, requesting that neighbor to kindly restore the locomotives again because its individual economy is locking up. The country that labeled Canada a fuel station with frost was requesting the fuel station for transportation. The country that insisted Canada's Prime Minister step down was now soliciting Canada's partnership on a $573 billion supply chain crisis. Trump's public presentation was telling in its unawareness. We need Canada to be a dependable collaborator in continental infrastructure, dependable. The country that withstood 18 months of financial aggression was being requested to behave dependably. Behind closed doors, one instance encapsulated the complete emergency. Accounts from 3 authorities knowledgeable about the session described Trump posing his counselors a solitary inquiry during the briefing on the rail interruption. Why do they control our railways? The explanation that CN and CPKC are independent corporations that obtained American rail properties over decades through proper corporate dealings sanctioned by American oversight through accessible market acquisitions that the United States endorsed and enabled reportedly generated a quietness in the space that continued substantially longer than the clarification itself. the President of the United States had just discovered in actual time that Canadian corporations control essential American infrastructure, and the response to his inquiry was because you permitted them, because you sanctioned it, because you never contemplated that the nation you chose to penalize might be the nation that transports your cargo. And Canada's reply was not what Washington anticipated. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a rejection softened with diplomatic sympathy. It was something harsher. It was a strategy. Canada formally rejected the collaborative railway stabilization structure. The rejection was communicated through a formal diplomatic transmission and a concurrent public declaration. No vagueness, no pathway for reconsideration, no indication that the conditions could be revised. The express justification was methodical. Canada is under no responsibility to fund cargo operations that advantage sectors in a nation that has enforced tariffs, commerce barriers, and financial pressure on Canadian manufacturers and Canadian laborers. Cross-boundary rail operations are a business function, managed by independent Canadian corporations, making logical choices based on present commerce quantities and projected market trajectories. Canada will not manipulate those business choices to bear the results of another administration's commerce strategy. And then Canada declared what it would be constructing alternatively, the $30 billion East-West Rail Pathway expansion, the biggest individual rail infrastructure commitment in Canadian records. Enhanced capacity to the Port of Vancouver, the Port of Prince Rupert, Canada's Pacific entryways to Asian markets. Enhanced capacity to the Port of Halifax and the Port of Montreal. Atlantic entryways to European markets, fresh intermodal hubs linking interior manufacturing zones to both shorelines, twin tracking and capacity improvements on the transcontinental primary routes, and the element that linked everything. Fresh rail connections incorporating the East-West pathway with Canada's Arctic maritime infrastructure, establishing a unified supply chain from Canadian extraction to Canadian rail to Canadian harbour, to Arctic maritime pathway to worldwide buyer with the United States nowhere in the sequence. Every dollar of East-West infrastructure is a dollar of capacity that supports Canadian international shipments. Every ton of cargo capacity introduced to East-West operations is a ton of capacity that is not accessible for North-South cross-boundary operations. Canada isn't merely rejecting the rescue. Canada's constructing the infrastructure that renders the American rail reliance lasting because the fresh east-west capacity will produce its individual earnings, draw its individual dispatchers, and generate its individual appetite. The east-west pathway doesn't require the previous north-south movement to be financially sustainable. It is self-supporting, and self-supporting infrastructure doesn't get dismantled because someone else's governance shifts. CN and CPKC released declarations endorsing the expansion and verifying that capacity distribution conclusions are reached on business principles. Where appetite increases, capacity tracks. Appetite is increasing east and west. Appetite is decreasing north-south. The railways are tracking the